Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. The theme of today is mentality of change. I was watching Harry and Meghan on their new Netflix documentary a few days ago, and I noticed that Meghan, life was so difficult at the palace. Life was so hard. And words like this showed me that she hadn't really moved on, that they were kind of stuck in that place when life was so hard. The reason why I mention this is because after watching them on Netflix, I was listening to a podcast about them. And they had 5 young people and 5 older people discussing not only Harry and Meghan, but the problems that the world seems to face. And what was very interesting about this podcast was that the younger people didn't seem to have a lot of hope. They were saying, life is full of problems and I'm expected as a young person to have some answers. How am I supposed to cope with COVID, university, thinking about my future, bills, rising energy costs? But yet the older people who had experienced more bad things in their life had much more hope. They were saying things like, well, it's a bad time for us right now, but we can expect things to get better because sooner or later they always do, and we have to live regardless of our circumstances. And I was thinking about this in relation to learning English. You know, some of us have a kind of a can-do attitude, and some of us have an attitude of wariness and really thinking, is this thing going to work? And then there's a third group, usually my students, who are completely hopeless. Oh, my English is terrible. I have no hope for my English. I've tried everything. You must understand that I'm different from other people. I can't learn like other people. Isn't it strange how we do that? Isn't it strange how we paint a picture, put ourselves in it, and then declare hopelessness? So first we create the prison cell, we decorate it, and then we move in and we give it a label such as my English. Now, I know about this because I'm also guilty of this. I'm learning Persian, and I'm the very first to admit that it's probably one of the hardest things that I've ever done. But it's not impossible. It just means that I have to change my attitude towards learning. Sometimes I wonder if the people who put the probe on Mars ever stop to think about that. The planet Mars, we don't see, we don't know, and in fact, we are billions and billions of miles, or if you're using the metric system, kilometers from it. But yet, with great precision, they managed to drop a probe into Mars. You know, that little Mars rover that sends us Facebook messages with updates about what it's doing. They were relying on something higher, weren't they? It was like they had laws of mathematics and laws of science to prove to them that this thing, which they couldn't see, this thing which they didn't know, this planet which they had never visited or seen, was there and could be explored. Now, how strange is that? It wasn't a thing of faith. It wasn't a thing of hope. It was a thing of, well, science tells us we can send this little Mars rover probe and drop it on the planet. Do you see where I'm going with this? If you stop to think about your English, the thing that keeps pulling you up and moving you on isn't you. There is some kind of a science out there that some of us tap into and some of us don't. Just like the young people in the podcast who didn't see any hope for the future, I have to say that if I thought that learning Persian was only between my brain and the grammar book, then I would have quit a long time ago. Yet, when you have an expectation of things getting good or getting better, it seems so much easier. We're living in a world right now which suggests to us that it's a very broken place. Every day we hear of wars, bombs, natural disasters, political problems, issues regarding costs, energy, and it seems to be that there's no stone uncovered. They just keep going on and on, trying to find more negative things to present to us. On one hand, the quicker things are exposed, the quicker they can be dealt with and fixed. But on the other hand, as they reveal these things to us, it just looks like our world is going a little bit crazy. And in the middle of all of that, we're expected to learn English. Now, going back to my point earlier about the groups, there was a group of 5 young people who felt that the world was a terrible place that they didn't want to live in, and the 5 others who had a lot of hope for the future. Why do you think older people want to learn English? Clearly, the world isn't so bad. Otherwise, it would have taught them that there was no hope with learning English, and in fact, no hope with anything. But yet, more and more older people are the ones who are learning, and more older people seemed, at least according to the podcast, to be much more positive about the future. And that's because they're old enough to see progress. They have kind of like an inner trust, which allows them to move forward without worrying too much about the consequences and where it's going, because they know that sooner or later everything will work out just fine. So what about everybody else? Why don't we all have that attitude? Well, I'm not asking you to rush to the nearest mountain to meditate for 5 days, but I'm sure you will admit that, like I said a few days ago, nothing is good or bad except your thinking makes it that way. If that really is the case, then changing your thinking is the key in many ways to changing how you see English. It's very easy to fall into a rut. You haven't had a holiday for some time, the kids are screaming, the boss is calling, the telephone is ringing, your sister wants to meet you at the weekend, and yet there's so many other things which come before learning English. If your thoughts really do make the world, then changing your thinking about everything that's happening is going to be absolutely vital. It would indeed be very interesting if you started to keep a note of how often negative thoughts come into your mind. Rather than saying, "Can I do this thing?" a better question would be, "How can I do this thing?" I didn't realize how many negative thoughts were coming to me at every moment until I started to keep a journal to see what they looked like. And sure enough, I have my journal here. On page 232, I can see a little note which says, "Whoa, I have a lot of negative thoughts." So that's a good place to start. But another place to start is to realize that if your thinking really does change the world, then it's time to change your thinking, not only about English, but about the validity and reality of what you see around you. Those of you who are old enough to remember when the year 2000 came, they told us there was a danger that old analog clocks, the clocks that we hang on the walls and the older mechanisms, would not be able to switch over after the year 2000 to the new millennium. And they convinced us that the apocalypse was about to start with things going horribly wrong, such as nuclear war. That's the one I remember. Then I also remember the volcano that was going to destroy us all in 2013. I think it was in Iceland somewhere, and it started to make toxic clouds. There were so many of these. I think the Hadron Collider was one of my favorite ones. That was the black hole that was going to open up and eat all of us. Then, of course, there was going to be nuclear war between the US and the USSR. That didn't happen either. The list goes on and on. Remember the impending ice age, which they prophesied in 1975, the world hunger, which was going to happen during the 1980s. And let us not forget COVID, that virus which had the potential for killing all of us, but yet the people who were leading the fight against it didn't actually obey the rules on it, at least not in this country anyway. And we're all still here to tell the tale. Well, most of us are anyway. These are just a few examples of people who told us things that might happen who were, well, wrong. But that was their thinking, and of course we respect them. But it does tell us that maybe what we see around us doesn't always paint the correct picture. And that's the same with your English. Well, that's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let's talk again soon. And goodbye from me.